Hey everyone, and a massive welcome. Oh, I don't know if I've gone live, if you can see me or not. Hold on, bit of a delay there, everyone. I think I've got some technical problems. If those of you in the chat could let me know if the audio and video is okay, that would be much appreciated. And back to the script, massive welcome to the second show of 2023 here on InfoSec Live of the CISO Experience from our leader, with real, open and honest conversations, or brew conversations as Barak and I have promised to have today. And today we have had one of with three amazing guests, with one more to come, and another 4 shows this week alone. And those that are new to the channel, my name's Simon Lindstedt, and I'm the founder of the InfoSec Live community, and also your host for this series. And by sharing stories and best practices over the last few months, it's led to 30,000 views and 6,500 hours of our content being watched here on YouTube by you, our amazing subscribers. So a huge thank you for your engagement. And if you'd like to support the wider InfoSec Live community, or indeed buy me a cheeky decaf coffee, we do have a few ways that you can show your appreciation. The ability to purchase super stickers, like your questions up to the top, and 3 tiers of membership allow you to show your support in can. But whether you join or not, being here and engaging with our content is what really matters. So if you're watching this live, please like and make sure you do drop those questions in the chat. And again, if you're watching on replay, drop the questions in still, and I'll make sure I ask them on the next show, as you, our audience, who make these events special. A little bit more exciting news for you. The CISO Experience is kicking off a UK and United States tour in February this year, with multiple locations across both countries, with an exciting series of events aimed at bringing our leadership together in a relaxed, informal setting with a focus on network knowledge sharing, not product pitches. So if you're interested in finding out more about attending or sponsorship opportunities, please do reach out to me today through the InfoSec Live community. And I want to take a moment before we join our first guest today to thank our grow and even more to the community. For us, sponsorship is about partnering with the right organizations, especially in what is a saturated vendor marketplace. And in my humble opinion, No Name Security are one of the only companies out there taking a complete proactive approach to API security, working with 20% of the Fortune 500 and covering the entire API security scope across 3 pillars: posture management, runtime security, and API security testing. They're backed by leading venture capital firms and have raised $220 million, achieving unicorn status only 1 year out of stealth, which is quite some achievement. They're privately held, remote first, with headquarters in Silicon Valley, an office in Tel Aviv and Amsterdam, and a link to find out how they can help your organization is in the description of the event below. And for those of you who are looking for work, after looking at their website last week, there are some jobs on there. There's some career opportunities as well, so make sure you check that out. Okay, enough rambling from Simon, and time for our next guest. Very exciting one today. We've got Barak Engel, who's a global security expert and industry veteran, pioneer of the virtual CISO concept. Barak has served as named CISO for security organizations across many industries for notable brands such as MuleSoft, SubHub Analytics, and Better. He founded his company EAMune in 2003 with the mission of having as many companies as possible develop security programs without major disruption to business operations. EAMune have since delivered on this mission at well over 100 different brands. A highly sought after publisher, his highly pragmatic, no non-whimsical approach to security management is captured in his books, Cyber Canon in 2020 and The Security Hippie, released in 2022 to rave reviews. And I will make sure I drop the links through the chat to those books as we go through the show. Boards. His recently completed fiction novel, exciting, is currently seeking an agent and publisher. If I was an agent, I'd be with you, Barak. But very excited for this one, folks. Make sure you get those questions ready for the Ask Me Anything. And if I can find the right transition video, I'm going to bring him on.
Am I on?
It seems I might be a bit glitchy, Barak. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you are a bit glitchy, but we will muddle through. One comment: it's Barack, like Obama, rather than Barak. Common mistake.
Sorry, Barak.
And it's immune rather than EA.
Yeah.
No worries. It's immune rather than EA immune, which is what happens when you let nerds try to come up with a marketing term, right? The word each is not pronounced EH.
Well, it's obviously worked though, hasn't it? I think if you can still hear me, then Barak, the delay with is a bit of a tricky one. So what I'm trying to do to make it easier for you and for our audience is shut up for a lot of the day, which is very, very unusual for me with my ADHD and desire to incessantly talk. So what I'm going to do is ask you an opening question. Firstly, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share with us today. Bit of background about you, but you to give in your own words, a bit of a story about how you've got into the industry and what's happened since you have.
Oh boy. So I would say a lot of old timers like me ended up there simply because we stumbled onto it. I was one of those kids that dismantled his Atari and because to see what was inside and then try to improve on how things were working right back in the old days. The original Apple IIe was a delightful platform with those expansion slots, and you could buy those generic cards and you could program EEPROMs. It was really awesome stuff, right? But it's not like security was really a career. So I ended up, like a lot of folks of the era in internet networking, very early on. I mean, I was there much earlier than that. I was there in the big, Usenet, the flame war that split Usenet and what have you. But later on, I ended up in internet networking, got recruited out of Israel by an American company that brought me to San Francisco. That was when the bubble was bursting. So it was a matter of trying to find the next people who would be willing to sponsor the extension of an H-1B visa. And I ended up at WebEx, where 3 months into my tenure at WebEx at managing the network team, there was a big breach. It was one of the earliest internet worms, Poison Box. It was a very famous Trojan back in the day in the early aughts. And the security, they actually had a security guy, but he didn't show up that weekend. Whatever, couldn't be gotten a hold of. So somebody asked me, "Hey, do you know anything about security?" Kind of a few things. So I ended up assembling a SWAT team to deal with this. Got all the systems back up and working before the markets opened on Monday morning, which was a key business driver for WebEx at the time. Believe it or not, a lot of the early work they were doing was related to how that was working. And so the company didn't really experience much disruption ultimately to business operations. And so I was asked to build an actual security team and department. And that was my first official security job. And did that over the next year and a half before I left WebEx. That was to this day, my first and only full-time head of security job. And it wasn't with a CISO title because that title didn't really exist other than in financials at the time. And so I always love to say that even though I've been a virtual CISO, although I think about it a little bit differently than a lot of people do. A lot of people think of virtual CISO as a sort of cheaper way to get a part-time CISO, and that's not in my conception. But with that said, even though I came up with that concept of vCISO, I love to say that I've never been a full-time CISO because that title didn't exist on my last full-time position.
I love that. And if you can hear me and there isn't too much delay, I want to go back to something you've just said then about what people think a virtual CISO is actually for, which is, maybe a cheaper alternative to actually employing the staff that you need, when in reality, you've got a very different take on that. And I'd like to hear a bit about that.
Right. So at least the way that I see it and how, that of course translates to kind of everything I do and everything my organization does and what have you. But is that, let me start here. I don't actually think that most companies need full-time CISOs. Let me just start there. Even a lot of companies that have them, I think the job is what I would call overwrought. People think that they need more security than they really need. And unfortunately, security is one of those weird disciplines that, especially if you're in a high growth environment. So let's focus on that for a second. Your goal is to climb that hockey stick, right? That's what you want to do when you're a high growth environment. And security is one of those disciplines that can come in and do that in about 3 seconds flat. But it can do that to a lot of organizations. It can be extremely disruptive, especially when it's cast as a sort of department of no, which a lot of people think of it that way.
Yeah.
But it is there is an important business enabling, business support role for the CISO, right? If you're really thinking down to the foundation of what it is, it needs to be a very pragmatic approach to helping an organization avoid what I would call the commercial technology liability, right? At the end of the day, what are you trying to deal with in security when you're really not going crazy? Right? When you're really trying to think, what am I doing here for my employer, for my company that is put me in this position? Well, at the end of the day, they're dealing with complexities of technology and electronic data, and they need to achieve certain business goals. And so you need to align yourself with those business goals and see if you can support them and help them reduce the liability that arises from the use of technology. And that sounds very similar, by the way, to counsel, which is true. Counsel handles, if you will, commercial liability in contract, and the CISO kind of handles the technology liability, because really, what's going to hurt your business? It's not the fact that you lost data in a breach that's going to shut the business down, for example. Sorry, hate to say this, folks. Breach is not going to shut your business down. I don't care how many people come and scream, oh my God, a breach is the event that will end everybody's careers. No, it might end your career as a CISO, but it won't end anybody else's. The business will continue. I can provide example after example, but literally just read the news.
Yeah.
I can name one, by the way, but can you name a single company that shut down because of a breach? Any notable brand? No, they don't really exist. The exception, there was a company called Card Systems International in the aughts that actually did shut down because of a breach. But the reason they shut down because of a breach is very telling and really illustrates the point I'm about to make. They shut down because they didn't have enough of a cyber liability umbrella available, and they got overwhelmed by the lawsuits from all of their B2B customers and their legal teams who came after them ruthlessly to claim damages. Let me tell you something. Even in privacy, a regulator is not going to shut a business down. They're going to make it a little bit painful with a fine, the 4% fine, but that's not going to cause your business to shut down, right? So I think a lot of the way we think about this is a little overwrought. And my goal, and to finally tie it back to the answer of how I see a good VC, so it needs to be somebody who is able to connect to the executive team at their level, to understand business operations at a business operational level. One of the recommendations I always make, if you're hiring a CISO, find if they have P&L experience. What are you talking about? They need to be technology savants. No. Do they understand cash flows? If you don't understand how your business runs
and how it makes money,
how can you pretend that you know how to protect it? No, protecting a business, right? Everybody says, "Oh my God, we're here to protect the business." You don't even understand how the business runs. You don't understand how it operates. How can you protect it? Anyway, it's a very long conversation, but back.
Well, do you know what? Let me jump in if you can hear me and there's no lag. Arto Kane, who is also a CISO, has made a good point here. Struggling against the Department of No preconception is a real struggle, thanks to our predecessors that didn't think about the needs of the business as much as they should have done. Yeah, spot on.
It's not just spot on. The problem is that it's still endemic.
Yeah.
Yes, I know folks out there that have kind of transitioned past it, but there are few and far between. The vast majority of people that have that title, by the way, talk about title inflation, but it's a lot of folks that have this C but have no business being a chief of anything. No, really, if you don't understand business operations, you can't be a chief of anything. It's just that's a fundamental requirement, not in real life.
So
So
for those people who,
if you go back, just a second, so just finish this. So if
yeah,
you go back and say what's a good virtual CISO, so somebody who does have that experience can bring it to bear for the organization, and be sort of a translating facility between those needs of the business and those efforts of those highly specialized discipline to align with those. But that typically doesn't require, in most organizations, a full-time executive suite, let alone the department that comes with it. And there's a problem generally. Every white-collar employee in any discipline, in any company, has the same exact primary job, right? Everybody, literally everybody. If you're in accounting, if you're in sales, whatever, if you're a white-collar employee in any company, you always have the same primary job, which is to justify your job. and the reality is that when you hire a whole bunch of really smart people and you give them just a few hours of legitimate work to do every week, which is what's really happening in most of these huge security departments, they're going to find things to do. And security is a lovely discipline. There's always things you can do. Right. And that's how you boil the ocean. And it happens really, really quickly when you bring in somebody without experience and say, you have a C title, right? A chief title. You have this large budget. You're doing stuff we're all really afraid of. Go hire people to fix it.
What about the BISO role then? So again, remember, I'm not an expert and I haven't got the experience you have, but I've seen the BISO title come up a lot in discussions and online the last few weeks and months. Isn't that what you've just described a CISO role actually should be?
So, again, financials have been ahead of the game simply because they've had money to protect for a long time, right?
Yeah.
So that's why the first actual CISO title was from Citigroup. I think 1996 is when that was created the first time. And BISOs have existed in financials for a while, right? Because they kind of understand that function fairly well. By the way, it's interesting that they don't tend to overdo things in financials, even though they understand the discipline probably better than most. And they actually generally have a need for this kind of formality. Sure, I personally think the CISO role shouldn't exist. It should be replaced. By the way, I'm writing about, so this is funny because I'm completing the second edition of my first book. So a lot of these things I've just finished writing, so they're fresh in my mind. But one of the things I say is I think that the CISO role should disappear completely, and will inevitably when people get tired of it and feel a little bit less afraid. And eventually that's going to happen, even though right now we're in peak fear. And so eventually that title will disappear and will merge, and you can see it already as a trend in Silicon Valley, right? People are hiring head of security and IT.
Yeah.
And so my suggestion is, you know what? Let's rip the Band-Aid. CIOs are already headed out the door. Let's have a new title called CISO. But the title is not Chief Information Security Officer, but actually CI/SO, or Chief Information and Security Officer, and just merge the damn things and stop worrying so much about it. But anyway, so yes, sure, a BISO is another way of thinking about how I think about vCISO. But what I don't like vCISO to be is this guy who is your CISO but cheaper than the full-time CISO, but still pretending to be a full-time CISO, because that's just you're doubling down on the mistakes.
Yeah. So you mentioned the word mistakes, and I think this leads us seamlessly onto my favorite topic of discussion. Maybe not mistakes. It's not seamless at all, actually. It's a bit tenuous, but we'll go with it. Vendors, I want to talk about. and I want to talk about the damage, the impact, whatever terminology you want to use, of the way cybersecurity products have been sold over the past few years, and how that has impacted the role of both CISOs and those in the C-suite who are engaging with security.
The most successful industry of the era with the most money sloshing around the pipes, full of extremely clever, by the way, the people who are doing the best job across the board in security, and I do mean this across every company in security, are marketers. They're freaking brilliant, right? They are creating a market opportunity that shouldn't otherwise exist. And a lot of people, by the way, in the C-suite, the real people in the C-suite, the ones that actually run the business and understand it, how it works, internally have a gut feeling that all of the people are kind of like fooling them, right? A lot of the CISOs, right? That's why you have the revolving door. I mean, we can talk about this. We can have a whole session just on that, right? But the marketers are very, very successful. They're targeting inexperienced people that have these fancy titles called CISOs and sell to them extremely effectively. There's a back of a paper napkin calculation I like to make, which is if you try to kind of tally up the aggregate claims of distinct market opportunities across all the security vendors out there, right? And you clear out the overlaps between them, right? You get to a number that's roughly 3 times the global GDP in terms of addressable market size, which tells you one of two things: either security is really, really important, or everybody's full of it.
Yeah,
I'll let you pick which one.
I think as well. Whilst the industry has been around a while now, it's still pretty much in its infancy. And if you look at how any industry changes, you get to a point where the market is saturated with products. And I think we're clearly not quite at that point yet, because I keep seeing new ones come out every day. But I wonder whether the global, if you want to use the word recession, I'm sure most governments will say we're not having one, but we clearly are. What impact that will have on these businesses? And do you see the amount of vendors in the marketplace reducing down to acquisition, or what do you see happening next?
Sure. Again, we're in peak fear. We're in peak money getting thrown at an industry, right? Eventually, those things will pass, as they have in the past in everything else. By the way, the technology industry too, right? The industry too, right now seems impregnable, right? It is the big monster of the day. It might not stay that way. I don't think anybody in the 50s in Detroit thought that it would look like the way it does today, right?
No.
So all of these things are natural trends that always happen, and it's the people who don't learn from history, right? There's all these cliches, right? If you don't learn from history, you're destined or bound to make the same mistakes. It's going to happen in tech too. In a microcosm of that, it's going to happen in security too. But you're right, security right now still in its infancy. What it is mirroring the rise of the CIO. If you remember, in the late 80s, who were those folks? They were like Windows system administrators, or the early 90s, right? That's people that knew how to manage these things. And suddenly companies realized, holy mother of God, we are dealing with these computers all over the place. We need somebody that kind of somehow understands them to manage the stuff. And then you had an IT industry that was exploding, and eventually it kind of came back down to its reasonable size in comparison to company operations. This will happen in security too. We're still like in the early stages, so there's another 10 to 20 good run for it left before it comes down to size, and you have enough leaders that have gained the business operations experience and can be legitimate executives and can merge those disciplines and can manage them in a reasonable way. But right now, I'm going to go back to that peak fear and peak money, and that generates an enormous amount of noise.
It does. And I want to just jump in the chat. Jose, great to see you, by the way. It's been a long time. 2 questions from him. The first one, if a technical professional, going back to what we were talking about earlier, if a technical professional wants to move into a CISO role, what would be your recommendations? You're not going to say a master's in business, are you, or are you?
Actually, one of my biggest recommendations in why CISOs fail is if you have a CISO or anybody who is a security leader, typical one, do them a favor, do yourself a favor, send them to Psychology 101, because ultimately you're dealing with people, you're not dealing with machines. And that is the key point, right? If you're a technology professional, the transition to CISO seems to be based on the fact that you're really good in technology. What you really want to be good at is be good with people. Because at the end of the day, what you're dealing with is people making decisions, people's behaving, people doing this or that.
And who do people buy off? People.
Yeah, right. Exactly right. I think that's probably the key insight I'll give you is understand that to be good at this. Now, the reality is, if you're good in technology and you want to move into a CISO role, somebody's probably going to hire you. So you might just say, hey, I don't need to do anything. That happens all the time. There's a lot of CISOs out there that have taken this path. So if you want to take this path, by all means do so. But if you actually want to understand how this stuff works in a way, how to be a good security leader, do try to get into the people side. And then the other thing is, I have another recommendation I make in, I think in Security Hippie actually recently. So it's my recent book is but if not, I've certainly written about it plenty, is that some of the best security leaders are ones that have had exposure to in SE roles, right? If you're in technology company, in sales engineering, that have had exposure to this front line of dealing with customers. It is an incredibly illuminating kind of experience if you are then going to try and serve your own organization, because it kind of naturally, especially if you've done it for at least a good year, it kind of aligns your thinking into what your customers need, if you're a B2B organization in particular. And if you're aligned that way, then you're not going to go chasing the ghosts, right? You're going to naturally you're going to have that sort of slant in the way that you're thinking about things, even if you are very technical, which a lot of sales engineers can be and are. And this mirrors a little bit of, I think it was GE that implemented this for a long time, right? They had this idea where they would take people who were candidates for executive roles and they will rotate them through jobs in the organization so they get experience with different things. Dear God, if you can spend 6 to 12 months as an SE, even if you're puking when I say this, you would do yourself a world of good as a future security leader, or at least a good one.
Okay, thank you. I've dropped the link to the Security Hippie book in the chat if anyone wants to check that out. Do you want to give us a bit more info about that? And then I want to talk about your first book, which I think is why CISOs fail. But let's talk about the Security Hippie first. What the terminology, the Security Hippie? Let's start with explaining that.
So it's not hippie as in, a flower child of the 60s. It's hippie as in sort of out of the mainstream thinker.
Yeah.
Or bullshitter, whatever you want, right?
Depends who you work for. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so that's really what it's trying to say. But the idea behind Security Hippie, and I don't think there's any other book in the industry like this, which means that you're probably not going to easily find it if you're looking for a traditional security book, because what it is just a collection of stories, real life stories. I've been in a triple digit number of security organizations, either running them or being involved with them or what have you. I have seen so many things pan out. And here's the thing. When you go out to the media and you read about breaches, it's very sort of dramatic and almost like, it's very Hollywoodish in the way that people report about it. You don't, a lot of fire and brimstone, not a lot of substance. And those things are also covered by the media. But what about all the stuff that's happening all around us every day, all day, with humans behaving the way humans behave, that creates security outcomes that are significant for the organizations involved? Nobody talks about these stories. So what I did is I took a whole bunch of these stories, kind of put a big pile, picked some of them and just wrote them up. I'm not trying to really teach anything. I'm just trying to share the story with you, with my own, what I've gained from those stories as I share them, and hopefully in a whimsical fashion, so that you can laugh along the way. So that's the idea behind Security Hippie. It's very easy to read, in the respect that you don't need any real technology background to read it at all. I mean, if you've worked on a computer, you can understand the stories. That's all it takes.
And who's whilst everyone can understand it, who's it ideal for?
I think it's if you have any even passing interest in the world of security, not necessarily even as a career. If it's a career, you'll have a lot of fun with this. But even if you just wanted to get a sense of what the hell is this thing about that the media is going not so about recently, here's a kind of a way to gain that get a little bit of insight, opening the door, opening the kimono, tearing the fourth wall, whatever you want to call it, of this fearful or fear-inducing discipline.
I look forward to receiving my signed copy soon.
If you said you're coming to San Francisco, right?
I am.
Let's do
Yes,
that.
we'll
Let's do
talk.
that.
We'll talk about that later. Definitely. Well, I want to talk about fear, and I want to talk about fear because in the industry I've spent most of my life in, which was financial services, we used fear a lot, or we used emotion a lot, especially when talking to business owners about key man insurance, family protection, business insurance. It was about telling stories, right? Storytelling. And the best example of this, which is awful now I look back on it, would have been in the late 90s. I worked for Sun Life Financial of Canada. And if you remember the tech at that time, we had a massive case this big with a big printer and a laptop that we used to take to the clients' houses. We used to go through what we called was a fact-finding process where we'd obtain soft facts, hard facts, and find out what their drivers were, what was important, etc. And then when it got to talking about protection, we had a really brutal slideshow that we used to use. And I'll use the family slideshow as a real example because it was always one that stimulated conversations in the house. And you'd have the husband and wife, for example, or wife and wife, husband and husband sitting at a table having a conversation, then start talking to them about, what protection have you got in place? Well, we haven't got anything. I don't need protection. Okay. Do you mind just watching this? And it was a three deck slideshow. The first picture was of mum, dad, or dad, and children. The next one, dad disappears, right? Dad's gone. And the question is, okay, dad got hit by a bus yesterday. What happens to your finances? What stops? Does the mortgage stop? Do your bills stop? And then the next slide would be wife disappears. So you're then talking about estate planning, wills, child protection, all these different things. And whilst that was an amazing tool to stimulate conversation, with hindsight, I look back with horror and think it's a little bit harsh. And I feel the correlation and the long winding road I've got to get to the end of this point is that every vendor out there seems to use fear in their narrative and in their communications. What's your opinion on the efficacy of that, and what could they do different? I told you we'd get there in the end.
Well, I mean, so selling fear is easy until people stop being fearful, which is the big point I think we're getting here, right? Right now we're in peak fear, so everybody's afraid. We have I call it the holy trifecta of fear, right? It's like
I love that.
Security is like everybody's afraid of it, right? Nobody understands it, but they know that they need something to do with it, right? They need to deal with it, right? So that's why security is where it is right now, and so marketers are doing a phenomenal job. They're like, oh, look at that. I have a world that's full of fear, not easy to quantify because of the nature of the discipline in many ways, and the fact that nobody really has figured out how to tie security to business goals. By the way, that's total nonsense, but that's how people are generally in the industry yet, which is part of the reason that it's so immature. And so they're doing a great job, and for them it's very effective. It's going to stop being effective at some point. It's about this point where executives start to wrap their heads around what the actual cost, if you will, of security is, or how it truly impacts business outcomes. And that's a lot of the work that I personally do in advising boards. That's when the role of the CISO will start to diminish, at least certain kinds of CISOs. At this point, the dominant form in the industry, and where the marketing based on fear is going to become less effective. But we have a good decade at least before we get there. So it's an interesting question you ask. Right now, in the moment, fear is an extremely effective tool to sell these things.
Yeah.
Here's the reality. It's another concept I'm writing about right now. There's the whole in retail. They figured a lot of this stuff out, right? When you go, they have the concept of shrinkage in retail, right? Shrinkage in retail is the idea that your store inventory doesn't match your records, your book inventory, and that's because people steal stuff, employees steal stuff, either hackers or insiders, right? You have fraud. Well, guess what? We have fraud, both vendor fraud and internal fraud in security too. The only difference really between security in that sense, if you think about it as some sort of management of digital assets, and retail, is that they're managing physical inventory in a store and you're managing digital inventory in the cloud, right? I mean, but it's the same thing. And so I'd like to coin the term officially today, if you don't mind, called security shrinkage.
Love
and
it.
start teaching it to the C-suite, to the executive teams, and basically say, look, just like in retail, there is an acceptable level of loss, right? And what you're aiming for is not to prevent all negative outcomes in security, but to reduce them to a reasonable size using a reasonable investment. So you really don't want to invest $500 or $5,000 to protect yourself from $100 worth of losses. That makes no sense at all.
It's all
right?
relative, yeah.
That's downright stupid. But this just points to another one of these problems. So we all know, if we're in security, we all know the CIA tried, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. That is the same three-legged stool today in 2022 that it was in 1960, when the only people who had computers were, the CIA, right? So the idea is that the problem here is that security, for some reason today, we're still stuck. Another reflection of how immature the industry is. We're still stuck into focusing only on that C, only on confidential. Let's prevent the attacks. I'm the protector of the company. I am the guard at the gate. I will save us all from all the buried out. That don't work that way. So availability, incident response, a huge term today, right?
Yeah.
Is it better to spend tons and tons of money to try to prevent every tinier potential negative outcomes, or to spend a lot less money in allowing your company to recover from those and accept that it is possible that you might get caught? I mean, it happens. Sometimes it really sucks. The vast majority of security incidents are not targeted. They're not because somebody went after you. It's because you got caught in a random sweep and somebody made a misconfiguration somewhere or forgot a patch or whatever. It happens all the time. So let's accept that it happens and stop realigning our thinking with this idea of security shrinkage. I think it will do a lot of good to the industry. I highly doubt that people are going to accept what I say and say, "Oh, look at that! That's the loveliest idea ever." But I really believe that that's kind of the way to path out of the fear mentality.
You just need to bring some fear into it for it to work. Before I get to my comprehensive notes I've written in my child's pen, because I can't find mine, I want to come to a couple of comments in the chat. Q Wade Billings, thanks very much for jumping in. You've made a few comments there. Fear sells.
Yeah, good comments. I see them.
Fear sells insurance and alarm systems. Yeah. I could not agree more. The one analogy I heard. Go on. No,
hold on. Before you even do the analogy on that, do you know what the most effective part of a home alarm system is? This is
my
proven.
dog.
90% of the effectiveness of a home alarm system is the signpost at the front on your front lawn, right? Because it deters a lot of people from trying to come in.
But again,
it's not the actual alarm. It's just the darn sign.
I completely agree. And again, it's down to perception and experience as to what alarm system you're talking about. Because if you spoke to a police officer and asked them to help you with an alarm, they'd take you straight to the security shop, and get you a burglar alarm. But if you spoke to a fireman, you'd end up with a fire alarm. So again, it's important to know exactly what it is you want. That was my only tenuous point. And the next point from Q Wade Billings is security shrinkage reminds me of a particular Seinfeld episode. Brilliant.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that.
The sign out front. Yeah, no, thank you. And the bits I'd written down, on what you were talking about, I think it was Q Wade as well. Was it him who mentioned
the impact on reputation? Yeah,
reputational risk. So I want you to talk about that for a little while, please.
Again, it's the beauty of the fear of reputational risk. By the way, the actual beauty of it is that it's one of those things that's impossible to really quantify. Right. So once you have something that's impossible to quantify, or at least very difficult, I wouldn't call it impossible, and you combine that with a fear of unknown outcomes from unknown actors doing unknown things, what do you get? A marketing, green field, right? It's beautiful. It's like the sheep flying around. If you're a marketer, like, holy crap, I can really go after that one. It's fantastic, right? But the reality is, I always like to challenge this. It's like, okay, all right, reputational fear. So, I've asked this question many, many times. Can you name one person in your inner circle, outer circle, planetary circle, somebody you know, I just want to name, that has stopped going to Target to shop because of their brand got damage of the thing? TJ Maxx to shop, stopped interacting with Royal Bank of Scotland and stopped having their bank accounts there because of the reputational damage. Any business that has stopped using Equifax, right? The anybody who stopped using, I mean seriously,
it's never ending.
The reality is that these impacts, the reputational impacts, they're there for a short amount of time, right? And then they dissipate if you're a business that's operating.
Yeah.
With one exception, and this is the exception I want kind of like to note as a general one, not the specific use cases, but there's one generalized use case that is really, really important, which is when a company, any company, is the most vulnerable to reputational damage in its entire life cycle as an organization. And at least in companies that are growing, right? And that is in the roughly 12 to 18 months leading to the IPO. And the reason for that, and this is for B2B companies, by the way, again, it's a little bit specific.
Yeah.
But it's because that is the point when your aggregate liabilities to your customers tend to rise very quickly. You're selling a lot faster to a much larger, customers that have much larger and more well-equipped legal teams to go after you for damages. But your internal ability to contain those damages through liability insurance, through other mechanisms, is not rising as fast or not evolving as fast. And that's a really key point. That's a really critical point in a company's life. And a good CISO should be very aware of that. So if you're working in one of these, because I keep going back to technology companies, because technology is the dominant industry of the day, right? If we were in the 60s, I would have talked about car companies. I'm talking about technology companies. They're rising the fastest. They're the most that are out there. Every new company that gets created is 80% going to be a technology company these days.
Yeah.
And so those
50% got AI in it as well.
Right. Yeah. So if you're working at that, you need to be attuned to that, because that's part of your business lifecycle. That's an area where you kind of really have to worry about reputational damage, because if your reputation does get hit at that point, then you might not succeed in getting to the public market. By the way, I can prove this with the Joe Sullivan case. Pretty much, if you surmise based on all the public filings and the court case and all that stuff, the big reason that they got so nervous about disclosing to the FTC the second breach and shuffled it through the HackerOne program, all of that stuff that happened, was because they were kind of like on the road to an IPO. They were in that critical window, and they really couldn't afford the extra reputational hit in that window of time. It's a great case illustrating that point. But yeah, otherwise, look, yes, you're going to have a short-term damage. It's going to be a thing, but that's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of security shrinkage, right? So just accept that there's going to be potential. Security incidents are still really, really rare. I know we hear a lot about them in the news, but the reality is you have to be extremely unlucky, and they're very, very rare. If they happen to you, they happen to you. That's life. Just accept that it could be. That's life. Take a deep breath. Have a good way to recover from them quickly, so you can continue operating and reassuring your customer base and doing all the things that you need to do in order to continue working, and move on. It's okay.
And you might not even need a shiny silver bullet magic tool to do that as well. You could potentially just spin up another instance of your AWS and put a different password on it, couldn't you?
Well, my free recommendation, we make this to every new customer that we serve at Immune. We say, here, we have a really cheap way for you to have a 95% reduction in your overall risk profile for the organization if you happen to operate in the cloud, right? If you're a company that has your stuff in somebody's cloud, and people are like, okay, what tools do we need to buy? You don't need to buy anything. Literally, are you operating in AWS? Open a second AWS account, completely different credentials, not the same stuff that anybody else uses, and do a cold copy every day of your environment. That's all I want you to do. I don't want you to do anything else. Just do that, so that if your primary thing gets taken, you can shut it off, turn on the new one, and keep going. Very cheap, very simple. Doesn't You don't need to do that much. And I'm not talking about buying 57 different tools to try and prevent tiny little potential outcomes, right? That you can't really do because people manage this stuff.
It is, and it reminds me of the day when I used to plug one of these into my server every night before I went home and put it in my briefcase in the car, which is a little while back now. One more point I want to get to here, once I've managed to put this wire away that seems really unnecessarily long, is another phrase that vendors come out with that really gets on my nerves, and this is return on investment when it comes to cybersecurity. I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but I did work in finance for 25 years, and I would say it's more debt management than I would the former. What would your opinion on the terminology ROI be when it comes to cyber products and services?
We did touch on this earlier a little bit. So I vendors will tell you they can't do a good job with ROI, right? I mean, if you talk to security vendors, the sales team, they'll tell you, yeah, it doesn't really work. I haven't been able to be successful with it, and that and the other. But that's just a reflection of two things, right? It's a reflection of the immaturity of the buyer, right? So your typical CISO doesn't actually understand how ROI is. Again, not in a. Of course, they understand logically how it works, but functionally they don't live it. That's not a thing that they generally have to do. The reason is the industry itself is immature, and people sell and buy based on theoretical outcomes, and all these things that we talked about, the trifecta of fear, and so that also obviates the need, right, to do a proper analysis of expenditure. Right. And so the ROI, what do you need an ROI for? Well, you need an ROI when you actually have to compete for investment with other people that need to make investment, which is how budgeting cycles typically work, right? And show that the things that you're investing in are more important to the company than other things. Right now, we're in a moment in time where CISOs generally don't have to do that. If anybody thinks that that's going to continue forever, I mean, come on, it sounds farcical on its face. I hope everybody understands that's not going to continue. But you probably have a good decade of this sort of approach still ahead of you, maybe even two.
What would you say, before I move on to why CISOs fail? I want to talk about what vendors could do right. So for the vendors out there that are watching, because I know there are some, and we've probably upset them all already, and it wasn't personal, it's just my opinion. What can they do differently, and how can they engage with security leaders?
I'm kind of actually going to say, it's not that they're doing badly, right? They're doing well. They're growing. They get profitable quickly. They're growing quickly. They're making cash. They're doing very well. The marketers and the salespeople in those vendors, they're doing a phenomenal job. They're doing a phenomenal job because they have a lovely greenfield opportunity for themselves with a really massive green field to go after, right? All I'm trying to caution about is that that's not going to last forever, but I think they understand that. Good marketers and good salespeople get that really, like, instinctively, really, really well. And so it's not that they're not doing the right thing. I do. If you want to talk about the weird forces behind it, the investment, the VC community is, another people we might want to, potentially challenge on this thing, because, gosh, we should have a whole other session on the dynamics of that behind the scenes. I just think that it's a matter of time. We have this thing. I think I want to talk about this because something I talk about ever so often, and I think it's really, really important. This is a Western business culture thing, a very American business culture thing. I call it the action bias, right? We usually think of problems as in, like, what do we need to do? Right. Not even problems. Sometimes it's just, what do we need to do? It's always about what's the next thing we need to do. It's always in the active voice. But there are plenty of times in life where the correct action is no action. Is literally sit back and observe, right? Sit back and observe, take a deep breath. It's okay. Life will be fine, right? More Eastern philosophies, right? Which some of them I really, really love. And they're true for business too. We have so many. I mean, you go to MBA school, you will find many discussions of companies that just went and did and ended up destroying themselves from within that way.
I did that.
Having the judgment. Well, but having the right judgment of when it's the right time to take action, and being able to accept that sometimes not taking action is the right thing. Investment is a great example of this. Think
it's really hard though when you've got ADHD and all you want to do is actions all the time.
Right. But Warren Buffett, right? He always says this, right? Just put stuff in companies you believe in and forget about it for the next 5 decades and you'll do great, right? But that's really hard for people to do when the markets are gyrating every day. The same applies here. We have a tendency to think of this in terms of action bias. Even the question you asked, all I'm saying is this will work itself out naturally. It's just going to take a little while. In the meantime, vendors are doing the best they can to support their own businesses. I can't possibly fault them for doing that, even if it's personally annoying to me on a daily basis.
But it's still working. And I think Q Wade Billings has come up with another couple of amusing comments here. I'm going to have to bring them up. First one, sounds like you're suggesting the best security defense is a good operational offense. This sounds like it should be on page 1 of the book of Duh.
I need to give Wade.
You need to connect with
medal.
him.
Can you give him the medal? Can you give him? No. I know who Wade is, but we need to give him a InfoSec Live Medal of Honor for these comments.
What I'm going to do, if it's okay with you, and don't hate me for this. But I'm now going to drop your LinkedIn profile in the chat as well, just in case there's anyone who wants to bombard you with messages even more and sell you stuff. But what I want to talk about at the end. Oh, no, Q Wade Billings' final comment, which is the best one. Thank you, Simon and Barak. Very educational and entertaining session. I'm off to fire my CISO. Sorry about that.
Boy.
So we've obviously back to winning friends and influencing people. My recommendation for anyone who's looking to improve their social skills and leadership skills is to read the very old book with that very name by Dale Carnegie, which I think still holds an awful lot of value for anyone who wants to improve their soft skills and work out how to deal with people. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left and I want to focus on this, if I can find the link, which is, I believe, your first book, which is Why CISOs Fail, the one that you're updating at the moment. The missing link in security management and how to fix it. Could you give us an overview of that? And I'm going to drop a link to the website in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah. So this is from, I wrote this in, I think, 2016. It came out in 2017. The general idea there is that still even more valid today than it was then, to my great surprise, is that security is not a technology discipline. So stop thinking about it as a technology discipline, right?
The vendors are going to love you.
Well, but that's what I believe. And so the book it's a small one, right? It's a book that I wrote with the idea that you can read it on a single transcon flight. So I was trying to kind of aim to a number of words, which ended up being something like 60,000 that would allow you to read it in about 5 hours or so. And it's not a big tome. It's very approachable. Again, I try to avoid technology terms wherever possible, and so it's readable by anybody in our world these days that has interacted with a computer. But what it tries to do is it tries to pick. Tries to take each part of the CISO's life and say, look, this is how you think about it, rather than in a technology lens, but through a people lens or an organizational, operational lens, what have you. And it has 2 chapters that were perhaps the hardest to write because I was writing them without any frame of reference out there, which is the CISO in sales and the CISO in legal, right? At the time that I wrote this, nobody was talking about these things as far as I could tell. So I kind of had to invent the terminology in a way, right? So those are in there too, but I really do believe that a good CISO has a role to play in sales, in externally facing to the company's customers, whoever they might be, by the way, B2B or B2C or B2B2C or whatever. And in legal, the CISO's role is critical. Now, today they're more well understood, and so the book is in a way much more valid. But yeah, to my greatest surprise and delight, of course, a couple of years ago, it was nominated and inducted into the Cyber Canon. So my publisher came and said, "Hey, can we do a second edition?" I'm like, "Okay, I'll stop thinking about it." But it's going to be at least a year until that comes out, so I I wouldn't necessarily wait for that.
Okay, thank you. And final question: what are you working on at the moment, and what's coming up in the future?
Well, at the moment, I think I mentioned that I finished a fiction novel in a whole new setting, which I just a couple of days ago launched a campaign to try and find an agent. It does have the advantage of, for people in this audience, that not only does it have or has there's a quasi intelligence agency that's operating behind the scenes that does stuff, and of course it's based a little bit in my experience in the world, but I also had a couple of hacker friends read through this thing with a hacker lens and pick every hole they could in the story to make sure that there isn't any. So it's pretty darn tight in that respect. I'm kind of pleased with that. I don't think that would appeal to anybody else, but people in this.
How different was it? Because I'd love to write a fiction book. So this is a personal question. I'm about 200,000 words into my life story, which will be posthumously released because of my children, and I don't want to destroy their futures. But for me, writing a fiction book is very, very exciting. I consume fiction as a form of therapy on a daily basis. I use Audible. I listen to fiction books all the time, and I do that as a form of escapism. How different was it, or was it more difficult writing a fiction book, or more enjoyable than writing a factual one?
Much more enjoyable for me.
Yeah.
And ideally, I hope that this thing does get published, and if it gets successful enough, I might pivot to doing a heck of a lot more of that and a lot less in the security field. So
love that.
I really had so much more fun doing that than pretty much anything else I've ever done.
And last question, we are over time, but again, it's a personal one. How did you even start writing that book?
Oh, it's a combination of things, right? So I've always had that as a thing, and I've had some of the ideas, and then I ran a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, and the people that were involved in it were they were so vivid in the way that they interacted with the world that I was presenting to them, that they're those characters that they brought to the table really stuck in my head. And so at some point I'm like, dang, you know what? It's the pandemic. Let me write a novel. And so I'm really honoring those fictional characters that they brought to the table.
And they're always the best books where you've built the characters up on past experiences, I feel, as well.
Right. But so the book itself is not the campaign we ran, but the characters in it, the heroes, are based on those people that they brought to life in our interactions over a couple of years. So
I love that. Thank you. Now look, we're over time. I've got a couple of things I want to say at the end before I do. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing today. And have you got any last words of wisdom for anyone out there looking to become a CISO before we clear up?
Just again, people, business operations, get those exposures and walk into this with a clear eye. You just don't want to find yourself being part of that revolving door. No. I understand it can be exciting to get the title, but try to respect it, and I think it will respect you back. And I think the best CISOs out there, the ones that end up being candidates for, say, COO in the future, are the ones that walk into it with these insights, rather than the ones that walk into it with the bully stick and just like, technology, I'm the smartest person in the room, right? That's
there's a whole nother debate about that, because my argument is, if you are, you're in the wrong room. I mean, again, I'm fairly low intelligence and low IQ, so it's quite easy for me not to be the smartest person in the room. But I think surrounding yourself with the right people is hugely important in life, whether you're talking about work or not. And to quote my late grandmother's favorite saying, lay down with dogs and you get fleas. So if you want to flip that on its head, make sure you're surrounding yourself with the right people and taking the right advice. So for everyone who's tuned in, a huge thank you for the engagement. One thing I want to mention before we wrap up, if you look down the bottom there, oh, look at that. That's good. If you look down the bottom there, you'll see that the CISO experience is going on tour, and we're launching this year. We're starting off in Cambridge in the UK in February, followed by London, Leeds, Manchester, and Edinburgh. With a quick hop, skip, and a jump over the pond, we will be also coming to potentially Atlanta, Georgia in February as well, followed by Austin, Texas, Tampa, Florida, New York City, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco. So if anyone out there is interested in being involved as a participant in what I hope will be a chance to network and collaborate, share ideas, best practice without having vendors pitch you anything too much. I say too much because we are, of course, looking for sponsors. So if you are a vendor who hasn't been completely offended by everything I've said today and you are interested in sponsoring any of these events, please do reach out to me. My email address is at the bottom. And for those of you that have tuned in, again, a massive thank you. We're back again tomorrow, 2 episodes tomorrow, 2 episodes Friday, more knowledge sharing, more chances to learn. Barrett, you've been an absolute gentleman and a scholar. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Simon. This is great.
Take care.